Welcome to another special edition of the Timco Retail Manager course. We built the Timco Retail Manager application to simulate what a real-world application would look like so we can use it as a test bed. One of the big areas of focus was on upgrading to .NET Core, and we're currently in the middle of upgrading these projects to .NET Core. Now in this video, we're going to finish our upgrade of the what's going on. It seems to work all right. It seems to boot up and it seems to run. We get the login form, but when we try to log in, we get not found, which is interesting. And then we looked at the Kestrel to find out, well, why isn't it found? And we see that we're getting a 400 message. Okay, that's or 404, I'm sorry. 404 meaning the endpoint / token is not being found. So we didn't have a / token. Now I did a little bit of playing around afterwards just to see what else I could kind of poke out of this and get to work. And I found out something interesting. Now first of all, if we were to run this again, I should have kept it going, but if we run this again and bring up the API, okay, there we go, and I were to go /product, I think it's product, maybe it's products, let me see real quick. So you have the API, we have controllers, and it's product singular, and we have just a get. But notice it's authorized for role cashier. So /product should give me a list of products only if I'm authorized. And that's actually /API/products. So API/product. And I get this instead. I don't get an authorization error. Instead it says, hey, it can't find the connection string. Okay, so this configuration manager isn't working the way we intend it to, and we can't get a connection string. So I'm going to stop it right here, and we're going to do something that normally, well, this is a good testing step, okay? But this is not a final solution. I'm going to return the actual connection string. So let's go to WPF, let's go to app.config. Oops, not WPF, it's the API. So the old API, and the old API's web.config, there we go. We have TRM data. So this right here is the connection string that we'll normally be looking for. Now you pass in a name, but really we're always asking for that one connection string. So I'm going to fake it by passing back the connection string. I have to put @ in front of it because of this character right there. So this is not something you want to check in a source code, but it's great for testing. Okay, so I'm going to run this again, this time passing back a connection string. So I'm bypassing the problem I have with getting the connection string. And now let's come up here and go to /API/product. And it gives me back a list. I don't know if you can see that or not. That's actually the products. Isn't that interesting? So I've got an authorize attribute on there that says you have to be authorized. Oh, and by the way, you also have to be a cashier. And neither of those is getting, we're not listening to either of those. So you've got a bigger problem here than just we don't have /token. We're not actually doing authentication at all. Okay, there's nothing in here for authentication that's doing this the right way. And that's actually a clue that makes things a little better. We're going to figure out how to add token authentication into this web API. Okay, so first I want to take care of this problem though, because this, we don't want to check that in the source code. I don't want to keep it there. So I got to figure out a way to get a connection string into, or a configuration into here so I can do a connection string. Now, we'd already upgraded the class library we're using, but it's evidently not good enough because we didn't catch this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constructor for this data access. I'm going to ask for I configuration. Do a control dot here. And I've got to install the package Microsoft.extensions.configuration.abstractions. Okay, I'm going to ask for config. And I'll do a control dot to create the field for that. And now instead of this return statement here, what I can do is say return, and I'll say config dot get connection string, which is actually an overload, just so you know, or I'm sorry, a extension method. Because normally it's just config dot get value, and then you pass in the path to the connection string. But this is a extension method that makes things. And I'm going to put trm data. And then in quotes, I'll put my connection string. So there we go. There's the other connection string. It should be that now, as long as we pass in an I configuration, that we get the value we're looking for from trm data. But we're not quite done here because we're going to break some things. Let's look at data access, where we have inventory data, and we're doing new SQL data access, and we're passing in no constructor. And that's a problem. So in here, I'm going to say CTOR. I'm going to ask for an I configuration. Do a control dot, config, control dot, and I'm going to create my private field, which then allows me to pass that in to my SQL data access. You see, before in our API, we were not doing dependency injection. So everything was just newing things up. Now we have dependency injection, but we need to actually rewire things so we're not doing this equals new. We'll get rid of this later, but at the very beginning, we're going to at least pass in what we need and pass it on to this class. Okay, so let's do the same thing for the others that are going to need this. So product data, constructor, and then pass this in, do a control dot to add the user statement, another control dot to create and initialize a field, and then finally we're going to do our underscore config and pass that in wherever we ask for SQL. Do it again with sales data. So we'll paste this in, do our control dot to add the using statement, do our control dot to create the field, and then wherever we pass in new product data, we're going to pass in our config. See, it's actually calling a different class. It's calling the product data. We can just pass it in. Later, we'll get this product data from our dependency injection. So wherever we have that new statement, we're going to clean that up. But we're trying to do this one step at a time instead of every step at a time. Okay, and finally, user data. It does ask for SQL data access, so CTOR. And then we'll paste this in. We'll do a control dot to add the using, and another control dot for the field. And then do our config. And I believe that's all of them. So if we were to do a build now, I think let's do a build first on our library. And the build succeeds. Okay, so library has been built, but we're not done yet. Okay, and the reason why is because we call these values up here somewhere in our controllers probably. So let's look at our inventory controller. And sure enough, we're doing the equals new inventory data. Now, again, that should come from dependency injection, but for now what I'm going to do is just do my constructor and ask for the same thing. We're going to install the package, and then we're going to do the, well, I thought I was going to install, there we go. Took a minute. Then we're going to initialize the field, and then we'll pass in that config. So we're basically doing manual dependency injection for right now until we wire up dependency injection. It wouldn't be a lot more to wire up the dependency injection, but I do want to separate that out. So let's do our control dot and our control dot again, and then our config. And our sales control is the same way. So we say config, config, and finally our user controller. Let's see if we actually need it anywhere in here. I don't think we do. Let's do a build solution. Oh, we have some more errors. In the inventory. Well, that's interesting. Aha. So we have it in the old API. So what we're going to do is the TRM data manager, I am going to temporarily unload the project. And now I'm going to build the solution again. And we have one more in user ID. So as is in the user controller, so therefore let's, we already have a constructor. So we just need to add an argument to it. So there we go. Control dot and control dot. And now we can say config. And I think that might have been the only one. Let's build our solution again. We have 5 warnings, or 5 errors, I'm sorry. Inventory data. Where is that? Did I not modify? You know what? I think I modified the wrong controllers. Let's reload this. Controllers. Yep, I modified the wrong controllers. You're probably yelling at me about that. configuration come from? Because I keep passing the buck up the chain, which is what dependency inversion is. But at some point, somebody's got to provide this I configuration. And yes, somebody does. But in our case, it's going to be our dependency injection system, which is already built into Web API. So we don't have to do anything to get it. It's already there. We can extend it or change it with things like AutoFac if we would like to. But the out of the box works for probably about 80 to 90% of the scenarios you'll use it with. So unless you have a little bit more complex application, you probably are fine with the default out of the box solution for .NET Core. Now, that still doesn't answer the question of, yes, but where does I configuration come from? Because if you go and look, I believe it's in Startup, we don't have anywhere where we're saying add the I configuration to the services, which is where you'd find this is in here somewhere. Well, that's because it's built into .NET Core to ask for configuration. So you can modify if you want, but there's already an I configuration there that's able to look at all the various configuration places and properly override which one is the most important. So it looks at environmental variables, it looks at your app settings.json, it looks at your app settings.development.json, and so on. So you can even add in later Key Vault and other areas. And I do encourage Key Vault because while this is great for testing, you would not want to put an actual connection string here for production. Now, the way we used to do it with .NET Framework is we would override this value or wipe it out and put a new value in when we do the build process for production. And that can be fine because you control access to your server. And so even though it's in clear text, the only people who have access to it are the people that already have access to the connection string anyway. So therefore, it's safe. However, you can put it in Azure and say override the connection string with this one, and that's encrypted. Or you can put it into Azure Key Vault and use it even on a local machine. You can use Azure Key Vault. And Azure Key Vault is super cheap, not expensive. It's very, very cheap to use. And they really do encourage you with that low price point to use it whenever possible to secure your passwords and your connection strings and other sensitive data. All right, let's see if this part works, which this is just testing, did we get the connection string right? That's all we're testing here. We're not testing whether or not authentication is turned back on, because we know it's not. So if I do /API/product, I get my products. Again, not ideal because we're not asking for authentication here. We're not authenticating you. We're not saying, are you a cashier? But at the very least, the API is working. Okay? So now we're passing the connection string through properly. We're not doing anything weird with how we save it. We're not cheating the system. We're getting the connection string from our app settings.json, which again can be overridden for production. So now we've got that working. Let's just add just those changes. So, and actually I'm going to exclude these changes. So let's add everything from the API. Let's add nothing from the TRM data manager, but everything from the library. Okay. So this is how you can use Git to properly stage or not stage parts of your work. So add proper connection string lookup. I won't put a message. I'll just stage this. I won't even push it. I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to reload this project. And then I'm going to right click, and it's going to go off a screen here. Let me see if I can get it up a little higher. I'm going to go to source control. I'm going to say undo. And it says you're about to undo pending changes to these 6 items. Yes? Why, yes. And so what I did was I just fixed all the things that I broke and did because I was changing the wrong API. Well, they're now all fixed because they should all be, let's close all documents and open up the controllers. They should be back to where they were before I started messing with things. And they are, which also means that this will no longer work because I'm asking for the config. Now, if you wanted to keep long-term compatibility where you have the new API you're working on, but you want the old API to still work, what you could do temporarily is you could create a dual constructor. So you can come down in here to your inventory data and create another constructor here, like so. And then what you do is you would just have a check whenever you look for that config to see if it's null. Okay, and if it is null, then don't use it. Maybe use a test value or something else, or use that old way of looking things up. Now I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to undo that, but that is an option to you. Okay, now let's unload the TRM Data Manager because let's scroll up here so you can see it. It's going off the screen. Sorry about that. So I'm going to unload the project. It's still attached, but it's no longer being built with the project. So it's still there if I want to reload it, but it's not going to be built and it's not going to be error checked. So now that config is out of the way, let's deal with our authentication. So to start with this, we're going to need to add a couple of libraries. And here's why. We don't have, in our old API, we used token-based authentication, where we'd log in, we'd get a token back, and we'd use that token as a way to say, yes, I'm authorized. We don't have that in the new system by default. It's one of those things where it's available to you, and you can plug it in, but you can also go to a third party and get their version of it. So Identity Server 4 or others like that, we could plug in here. We're going to roll our own. We're going to be as simple as possible with this just to get something working. I do wish they would have kept in the default or allowed for a much easier way of doing the default, but they didn't. They wanted to have that flexibility to choose whatever you want. So we're going to create our own using some of the libraries they provide for us in NuGet. So the first one is Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer. Okay, so there's the NuGet package we're going to add. We'll install that. We'll accept that. Clear it out. We're going to add one more, which is system.identitymodel.token.jwt. Tokens, sorry, plural. So system.identitymodel.tokens.jwt for JSON web tokens. That's what we're going to be installing and using. Okay, so now we have the of identity user. All right, so it's a couple of using statements here. Actually, just one, it looks like. And we're going to call this user manager and control dot to create that field as well. Okay, that's just a constructor to get a couple of things from dependency injection that we're going to need for the rest of this. Let's start off with establishing a route for /token. And this is going to be a post. We're going to say public async task of iActionResult create. We're going to pass in username, password, and grant type. And that last one we don't technically need. But because the original system used grant type, we're going to make sure we're compatible with that original system by asking for it. We're just not going to actually use it because we don't need it. Okay? So if we're going to do a check here, await. Actually, you know what? Before we do this create, we got to create a couple of methods to call in here. So let's create a method down here. You got to do a check to see, is this a valid username and password? So private async task of type bool. Add a request. Okay, and that's just it. So you pass in a username and password. If it's valid, or if it's not valid, we're going to pass back a bad request. What happens if it is valid? Well, that's where we're going to generate our token. So private async task of type dynamic. Generate token. Okay, we're going to pass in the username. So the first thing we'll do here is say user equals await user manager dot find by email async username, which we already know it will work and will find the right user because we've already verified that their password matches their username. So that will work. And then we're going to get the roles. Because remember that user does not return anything but the user information. But we're going to return all the roles for this user. So roles equals from, that's going to look familiar, you are in context dot user roles. We're going to join this are in context dot roles, not role claim, roles, on ur.roleID equals r.id. So again, we're grabbing the user roles and the roles, we're matching them up based upon the role ID matching. And then we're going to say where, and this is a new clause, where, and it's ur.userID equals user.id. So we're going to take the user we got and just say only get that user ID's roles. Select new ur.userID, ur.roleID, and r.name. That will give me a list of all the roles for a given user ID. It's going to have, this will be repeated. So you have user ID, the same user ID, the same user ID, all the way down, but we'll have it. And then we'll have the role ID that the role's ID is, and also the role's name. So I believe right now my user ID has cashier and admin. So it'll say my user ID, the first role ID, and cashier, my user ID, the second role ID, and admin is the name. So that's what we're going to have in that link statement. Then we're going to start creating claims, because JWT, or the JSON Web Tokens, they use a claim system. And so we're going to create a claims equals new list of claim. Control dot here to add our using statement. And then let's do curly braces and set up some initial claims. So new claim, claims type, claim types, there we go, dot name equals username. So we're going to first say one of the claims we're going to pass back is our username. And it's not equal, that's actually comma. So a claim is essentially a key value pair. And so there's certain claim types that are default or that are standard. One of them is the user's name. Okay? And this all comes from a standard schema. If you mouse over, you can see there's the schema that it comes from for identity. So name, well, that's going to be our username. And so we're passing that back. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to yes, I was. Dot, and you have a few of these, well, a lot of these abbreviations. Some of them are kind of self-explanatory, given name, family name, that kind of stuff. But the one we're going to choose is NBF, which is saying, what is NBF? That's not before. And that says that this token is not valid before a certain date and time. Well, in our case, we want to be valid right away. Therefore, let's say new date time offset, date time dot now, date time dot now. Make sure you get casing right. And then we're going to say to Unix timestamp, or time seconds, to string. Okay, that's a lot to type. What that's saying is that we're going to take our date time now and essentially convert it to Unix time seconds. So that returns the number of seconds that have elapsed since 1970 on January 1st. Okay, so, and this initializes a new instance at the offset. So there's an offset on this, but we're going to Unix time seconds, and that's where we're going to start from, or say not before. Okay, so not before, essentially right now. Next, we're going to say new. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to copy and paste this because this is going to be close, but not the same. Instead of NBF, we're going to have EXP, which stands for expiration. So when does this expire? I know that the help tips aren't exactly helpful. EXP equals EXP. Awesome. Don't know what that means, but cool. I had to look them up. So not before, and this when expires. And so it's the same layout here, except for we're going to say add days 1. That means it's going to expire tomorrow at the same time. And you may say, wait, that's way too long. No problem. Go ahead and change that. Add hours, add minutes, whatever you want to do to get this to work the way you want it for your system is fine. 1 day is fine for this system for us. And at this point, we're not going to get into refresh tokens and making this short and adding refresh tokens. We'll wait on that for another day. We're just trying to get it to work like it used to. Okay, so now I have these standard claims in. The username, user ID, when it is valid from, when not before, and then when it expires. But I need to add some more claims to it. I've got to add my roles. Well, how do I know what my roles are? Well, I just Googled those, essentially. I asked for those from the database. Now I can just do a for each. I can say, whoops, var role in roles. And I can say claims.add new claim, claim types dot role, and role.name. That's all I need. Now, no matter who you are, no matter how many roles you have, it's going to find that out and it's going to add that to your claims. All right, now that we have our claims and our role, we're almost done. We need to now create our token. So let's say new JWT security token. Here, but I'm going to try and take off that and do a control dot to add a using statement. Makes it a little smaller. So new signing credentials, and I'm not going to keep wrapping. I'm going to see if I can get this to work without wrapping it. Which do I have my? Yeah, see, it's hard to keep track of all these opening and closing. So new signing credentials, and then inside here I have new symmetric security key. And then in here, I have encoding, which control dot UTF-8 dot get bytes And then we need to give it a secret key. My secret key is secret, so do not tell. Like so. Is that a good secret key? No, it's not. But don't worry, we're going to make it better in just a minute. And so I do need a new line here. It's just too much. So now that closes out this, but now we need to say comma and security algorithms dot HMAC SHA-256. And then we need to say a new line, new JWT payload claims. And I think now I don't need these. So that's a lot of new. So let's talk through what it's doing. So what we're seeing here to create a new JavaScript web or JSON web token. We start with a header, and the signing credentials, we're using the algorithm for the signing credentials, not for encrypting it, but for signing it. We're using the HMAC SHA-256 security algorithm. The key that we're using to sign it, again, not encrypt it, to sign it, is we're using this encoder right here, which is essentially it takes the string and encodes it into UTF. Okay, and it gets the bytes of that. And that's the key that it uses to sign this token. Now, this key is very important. This is a secret key. If this key were to get out, then what would happen is somebody else could, using the HMAC SHA-256 algorithm, it could encode a new claim and say, well, you gave this to me, and we'd look at the signature of it and say, yep, that looks valid. So this key is important. So we're not going to put it into our source code. We're not going to leave it here. We're not going to make it my secret key is secret, so don't tell. We're going to make it into probably a longer string that is random letters and numbers, and we're going to store this in eventually Azure Key Vault or something similarly encrypted and protected. For now, just for testing purposes, we're going to leave it right here. Then we will improve it by putting it into our app settings.json, and then later when we go to deploy this application, we will improve it further by taking it out of app settings.json at build time and replacing it with that Azure Key Vault value or something similar. Okay, so the header has the signature of that's encoded with our secret key, and the payload is our claims, which these are our claims. So for every user, they'll get their username, their user ID, when it's valid from, when it's valid to, and then what roles they're a part of. Okay, so that is our token creation. Now we still need to return something. Now I chose dynamic here for a reason. I want to match up what we were sending originally, which was 2 pieces of data. So var output, I'm using var a lot here. And the reason why is because I'm using types that are dynamic, or they're from a link query where it's anonymous, or it's just from something where the output type is longer. So that's okay. So I'm going to say var output equals new our dynamic object. So access underscore token equals new JWT security token handler. Handler dot write token, and pass in our token. So that's what's actually going to write the token. It's going to create the string from our token. Next, I'm also going to pass back username, which we already have. And the reason why is that's what our original contract passed back from our authentication system. Finally, I'll return output. So our return from all of this generate token is we generate a token and we pass that back as access token, and we pass back the username, which is the email address of the user. Now that's technically inside the token. You could pull that out on the other side, but I'm trying to avoid rewriting things. So we're going to pass back these two values. Now that we have this generate token up here, we can say return new object result await generate token, passing in our username. And what this will do is it will generate our token. Once it's done generating the token and returning that dynamic value back, it's going to send that object back to our caller as our action result. Okay, so normally it's when you talk about controllers for web MVC, you're talking about returning pages. But in this case, we're not returning a page, we're just returning an object instead. So instead of action result, it's object result, which does implement iActionResult. So therefore, the object result is just an object, which is essentially just this object right here. So there's our /token on the authentication side. Now let's talk about the receiving side of those tokens. So let's go over to the startup. And by the way, if this felt overwhelming to you, I totally understand that. Security is tough, it's difficult, it's confusing, and doing it this way where we are the ones in charge of building it is a lot of work and a lot of digging through documentation to figure out the way of doing it and making sure that you're not leaving a security vulnerability somewhere. I would prefer, and at some point we will, I'd prefer to redo this to offload the work to somebody else. Whether it be something federated like maybe an Azure Active Directory, or whether it's something like a Google authentication or Facebook or somebody else, to allow somebody else to do the authentication for us. And we just say, hey, are they authorized? And if so, for what? And we take a big step back from controlling all this stuff. So yes, this is complex. This should work, and I'd love to have you review this. If you have any code review questions or thoughts on this process, maybe you see a bug somewhere, it's always good to not be one person alone doing this, because then you can miss something. So if you see something where you say, you know what, I think there's a bug here, and I think here's how you'd fix it, I'll definitely love to hear that. Put in the comments down below, and we'll talk it through, okay? I'm not going to claim to be the world's foremost expert on authentication systems. They are complicated, and it takes more than just having done it a few times or having done it 100 times even to know what you're doing here. They always change. Okay, so now let's talk through our startup. I'm going to add a couple of using statements here that I believe I'm going to need. Using Microsoft.open. I'm not sure if I need this yet. Let's find out if I even have it installed. I don't think I have it installed, so let's wait on that one. But I do need using Microsoft.identityModel.tokens. So we'll need that in just a minute. So now let's come down here to our services, and we're going to add authentication. So services.add authentication. arrow function. And then inside here, about the end, we'll put a semicolon, by the way. Inside here is where we're going to configure our different options. We're going to keep this pretty light. We're going to say validate issuer signing key. Did I spell it wrong? Control dot, doesn't have it there. It's there. We'll get there in just a minute. Equals true. Then I'm going to say issuer signing key is going to be new. And actually, I'm going to grab that from over here. It's the same thing as what we did right here. Okay, so it's the same key. This is the other side of things. And I think I see my issue here. Let me cut this out for a minute. I missed a level, and I am typing off of notes because there is no way I'm remembering all this. So don't think that I'm somehow Superman remembering everything. I'm not. So I missed a line of my notes. So JWT bearer options dot token validation parameters equals new. There we go. And then inside here is where we're going to have, I have too many curly braces now. There we go. So let's unpin this for a minute. There's our key, which we can control dot to add what we need to for that, for the using statement. And we need to put a semicolon at the end of this. Now we can add some other options here. So validate issuer. We're going to set that to false. We're not going to worry about some of these issues. So validate audience. We're also going to set that to false. We don't worry about the audience. You can add these in if you'd like. Validate lifetime is true. So we're going to make sure that it's not invalid. Now the last thing is we are going to check for clock skew. And what clock skew allows you to do is make sure there's a in here in startup, this is where we use your token and make sure that you are authenticated and your token has not expired. Okay? Let's try this now. Let's start it up and see if we have any errors. We probably do. And by the way, errors, not a bad thing. Okay? So let's start by going over to the web. I'm not sure why this keeps opening too large. I'm going to say /API/product. And it says this page isn't working. And if we look over here at Y, JWT bearer was challenged. We got a 401, which is authorization failed. So we can't get to the products anymore, which is a good thing. Okay. Now we can go over to our login form. We can log in. And it says sequence contained no elements. Okay, what's this all about? Well, we took our name identifier, which is user ID, and that's, as you can see from our locals window here, the user ID, it looks like a valid user ID, and let's actually capture that. So I'm going to copy this. Because I kind of cheated, and I know what the problem is. Where we did the user data and we're getting the user by ID. So if we do an F12 here, we're doing a lookup and saying do an SP user lookup in the TRM data database for this user to get the rest of the user information. Remember we did that? Where we have that information in the user table? Here's a question for you. Do we have, let's close this down. Do we have a user in the user table for this new user? Why, no, we don't. I actually already have it loaded up here. We have Tim Corey, but notice that the ID starts with 603. If I paste in this new ID in the ID column, notice it starts with F35, if you can see that. So it's a different person, even though the first name, last name, email address, and even the password are all the same. Because I'm a different person. I have a different account, even though I have the same login credentials. That's why we have a user ID. So I'm going to fill this out. Tim Corey, tim@iamtimcorey.com, and create date will leave blank, so it creates it automatically for us. Now that I have that information, let's start it up again. Now, eventually we want this to be created automatically when you sign up. You also get a user account. Okay? But check this out. I now have the ability to get to my cart. If I go to user management, fatal exception not found. Let's find out what's not found. Okay? So what we're going to do is, I closed that down, I probably shouldn't have. Let's go put a breakpoint and find out what it's not finding. So we're going to go down to our WPF, our UI, our view model, and that's the user display view model where we have in here somewhere, we have our constructor right there, and that calls the onViewLoaded await users. So let's put a breakpoint there. And now we're going to log in. We're going to users. So it gets to this point, and we step through here, right there. This is why Kestrel's so awesome. So I'm stepping through the front end, but I can listen to what's happening on the back end by just watching this console output. So where IIS might not have shown this, I get to see it in real time and see what's happening. So I had a 200, which means success, when I made the products controller.get call. Cool. But then I come down here, it successfully validated my token, and then I get a 404. What's the 404 on? Localhost 501/API/user/admin/getAllUsers. I'm not quite sure why that is giving me an error. Okay, so why is it not finding, so it's 404 means I can't find this. Why is it not finding API/user/admin/getAllUsers? So user, admin, getAllUsers. Let's stop this and go over to our, no, stop. There we go. And go to our user controller. Go down here, user API/user/admin/getAllUsers. It's there. So why isn't it finding it correctly? Now, if you've already spotted the problem, because again, I have kind of cheated and know ahead of time what this problem's going to be, cool, and you're way farther ahead than I was, because it took me a while to figure this one out. Because that route right there seems to be pretty clear. That's what we're calling. There is no parameters, so what's the problem? Well, let's do this. Instead of figuring this out, what I'm going to do is make my life a little easier in figuring it out by adding back in Swagger. Remember, we had Swagger in the original API. We want that back, and that will show me what all the different routes are, and it's going to show me why it's not available. So let's go to our Solution Explorer and add some dependencies. And there's quite a few with Swagger for the front end, so, or for the API.core. So Swashbuckle, let's just do Swashbuckle here. We're going to need swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core. So let's install that. we're going to need Swashbuckle Core, if it's not already installed. Some of these get double installed, which doesn't double install. It's just going to say yes, it's installed. We're going to need swashbuckle.asp.core.swagger. And then we need Swagger Gen, Swagger UI, and we're not going to use it right now, but eventually we'll need Swagger Annotations, so let's install that as well. Now, some of you may be twitching right now because I have installed a bunch of NuGet packages, and you say, oh, that's just horrible. There's just so many dependencies, it's just awful. I get that. But on the other side of this, what's happened is we've gotten away from monolithic dependencies. So we also complain of the fact that this NuGet package is 30 megabytes to download. That's awful. It's just so huge. There's so much stuff in it. And so the authors said, yeah, you're right. You don't use all that stuff. Therefore, we'll break it apart into pieces. And then you say, oh, there's just so many of them. Well, yeah, there are, because you broke it into pieces and you wanted 5 of those pieces. It may be of dependencies, because as we'll see as we go on, it can make life more difficult when it comes to upgrading. The more dependencies you have, the more restricted you are on when you can move and how far you can move. For example, Caliburn Micro is not yet .NET Core 3 ready, and that may freak you out. Don't worry, there's a solution for it, but it comes with using a preview build, which we're doing preview builds here as well for Swashbuckle. There is a balance between the two, okay? Sorry, a little bit of a soapbox there, but we've had that conversation before, one, 2 people at a time. I want to get that out there because that is a common thought, okay? So now that we have that, we need to add our Swagger in here. Let's get our Swagger on. So, services.add Swagger Gen. Setup, arrow function, inside here, setup.swaggerdoc, and then inside here, we're going to set up some documentation. So let's do a version 1, and then new open API info, which, let's back up, that's where the using statement comes into play that I had commented out here, is for Swagger. Open API info, and then inside here, we're going to have title. We're going to say Timco Retail Manager API. And the version is going to be V1. And let's go ahead and change the O to be a small lowercase. And then let's get rid of the extra spacing here and put our semicolon here and a semicolon there. So we're just doing a really basic initialization of this Swagger doc. We can come back later and really beef out Swagger and put the authentication back in with the tokens and all the rest. But for now, we're not going to worry about that as much. Down below, let's go after our authorizations. Ordering is important in this section right here. So we're going to say app.useSwagger, and then app.useSwaggerUI, and then we'll say, let's do X, and then we're going to say x.swagger endpoint, and we're going to define an endpoint for Swagger, which is Swagger /v1/swagger.json. That's what a JSON file is going to live for Swagger. Because remember, Swagger is at its heart a JSON file, which we then just put a UI on top of. And we'll call this Timco API v1. All right. So now that, in theory, configures our Swagger, those two settings. Let's run this. Rolled off a screen, you don't see it. But you scroll up, you can see the big red fail, and it says an unhandled exception has occurred while executing the request. Okay, so we got an unhandled exception. Ambiguous HTTP method for action, trmapi.controllers.inventorycontroller.get. Action requires an explicit HTTP method binding for Swagger 2.0. So what this is saying is we need to have some type of explicit binding for our inventory controller. Let's go look at our inventory controller. For our get, it does not say HTTP get. So now instead of having, and there's a post down here as well. So in our old API, it just read this based upon the naming convention. But it's saying for Swagger 2.0, you need to be explicit in this. Let me guess. This isn't the only one that has a problem. Price controller. Get. Sale controller. Post. Get. User controller. We already have a get here. We already have a get here. We have a post here, a post there. So it looks like all of these are marked. Our token controller is a different type of controller, but they are marked post, and the rest are private. So the one is marked post. Let's try it again and see if we've gotten them all. Okay, so wait for the API to start up. We'll do /Swagger. And there we go. Swagger is now up and running. Okay, so you have our inventory. There's how you call it. And again, we haven't formatted this at all. This is just right out of the box. But notice down here in the user section, does anything look squirrely? Our API for get all users is /API/user/API/user/admin/get all users. That don't sound right. Well, why is that? And it's the same for all the rest of them except for the very first one. So let's go over to our user controller and look at the top where it says the route is API/controller. So that's API/user. And then down here it says the route is API/user/admin/get all users. This route, the way we're doing it, is additive. So it added the top route and then it added this to the end of it. So therefore, take out the API/user everywhere, including the slash. Okay? Now that should do what we expect it to. It should have the right endpoints for what we're used to. So before I go back to Swagger, let's go log in, which that used to work, still does. Users, well, we have a breakpoint here. Let's hit continue. Check this out. We have admin cashier for Tim. We have managers, a role we could add. Let's add the role. Let's log out. Let's log back in. Go to user management. Tim has all 3 roles. No roles to add. So I can remove the manager. And now the manager is no longer part of Tim's account. So it's working the way it used to work. So that's just awesome. We now have our authentication in place. It's properly identifying if we're allowed to do something or not. So if we remove cashier, if we were to log out and log in, forbidden. We can't be a cashier. Go to user management and say, oh, that's right. I need to add cashier back to Tim. Now if we log out and log back in, Tim can be a cashier. So it's all working the way we expect it to. It's denying us if we should be denied. It's allowing us if we have the right role or if we're authenticated, if that's all asked for. So everything is back in place. In theory, we may have missed a thing or two, but I don't think so. And we have done a couple of small upgrades. We have a little better understanding of how the tokens work and what we can add to them. And we now have the newest version of Swagger in our UI. We can even add on top of that and make it even better. Okay, so that's the rest of the upgrade process for our API. So it's adding authentication back in. So now let's take all the changes we made and say added token. Let's add JWT authentication. And we're going to commit and push those changes. Since we actually already had, let's just commit and then go to sync. And notice we have those 2 commits because we have 2 different things that we worked on today. Really more than that, but for our small team, 2 is fine. We'll push those up, and now we have committed all of our changes, and we're ready to move on in the next video where we tackle what are we going to do with this desktop UI. We're going to move that over to .NET Core 3, and how is that going to work with Caliburn Micro. Okay? Until then, thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.